In this video, you'll learn how to use sashing to set your blocks. First, you'll see how sashing can add to the quilt's design. Then you'll find out how to calculate sashing sizes in Yardage. Finally, you'll get some tips for sewing the sashing and the blocks. These 6-inch blocks are featured, but you can use the information in this video with any size block. Here's a list of the information covered. Below you'll find links to each topic if you want to skip ahead. When all your blocks are completed, it's time to decide on a setting. Often quilters will use sashing if the blocks are different patterns, as it can help to unify these differences. Sashing can also add an extra design element to your quilt. It can calm down a busy quilt or add pizzazz to boring blocks. So how do you know when to use sashing? It comes down to personal preference. Do you want to add another color? Make your quilt larger? Are you a quilter that doesn't like to match points or intersections? If you answer yes to any of the previous questions, you might want to consider sashing. Once you decide to add sashing, lay out your blocks on different fabrics either at home or in a fabric shop and choose which one is most pleasing. Be aware that using striped fabric can be difficult. Solids or small prints usually work best. You might also consider adding posts or other design elements at this time. Once you choose fabric, you'll want to determine the width of your sashing. You can do this by adjusting the sashing to a width that you like. Traditionally, sashing would be no more than 1/3 of the block size, but today there's really no set rules. Just pick a size that looks good to you. I'll go with this 2-inch wide sashing. The cutting size will be 2.5 inches to take into account the 1/4 inch seams on each side. Make a sketch of your quilt in order to figure out the cutting sizes in Yardage. It doesn't have to be fancy, just nice enough to be able to count the different strips that you'll need. I have X's for the blocks, and I color-coded this to make it easier for explanation purposes, but it's not necessary. I'll need 6 of these strips to separate the blocks vertically, 2 of these horizontal strips, and 2 of these for the side borders, and then these 2 strips for the outside border. Write down the number needed of each type of sashing. And now for the cutting sizes. Since these blocks are 6.5 inches unfinished, each one of these strips will have to be 6.5 inches long by 2.5 inches wide. To find the sizes of these larger strips, add together the size of each block and each strip. Then add 1/2 inch for seam allowance. For example, for this longer strip, you'll add 2 inches plus 6 inches plus 2 inches plus 6 inches plus 2 inches plus 6 inches plus 2 inches. You end up with 26 inches across, but then you need to add 1/2 inch seam allowance. So this strip will end up being cut at 2.5 inches by 26.5 inches. Write down the number of strips and the sizes needed for each one of these. You'll use the measurement to calculate yardage requirements. However, don't cut any sashing until you complete all your blocks. These measurements usually change slightly after you figure out your block average. To figure out the yardage required, sketch out your fabric. This is 44, 45 inches, and I see for this sashing I'm going to need to cut a 2.5 inch long strip. I need 6 of those. Doesn't have to be perfect, and each one of these is going to be 6.5 inches. ... If you multiply 6 times 6.5, you'll end up with 39 inches in this row. So I'll only need 1 strip, 44, 45 inches for those inner sashing. Let's go to the next one. The next one strip is going to be 2.5 inches wide, and it has to be 22.5 inches long, and I actually need 2 of those. If you add 22.5 and 22.5, you'll end up with 45 inches, but that's cutting it really close. So I like to cut another strip 2.5 inches over, and that's going to be 22.5 inches. I'll have extra, but that's okay. For C, I actually need the same size strips, so I'll add 2 more, and this is getting pretty messy. So let's look at this sheet here. It looks a little bit nicer. So here's my fabric, and A is going to be 2.5 inches, B's 2.5 inches, this one's 2.5, the C's are 2.5, and for D, I'll need to cut 2 strips 2.5 inches. I'll need to cut 7 2.5 strips. That adds up to 17.5 inches, which rounds up to 18 inches, which is a half of a yard. Before cutting or sewing, you'll want to assess your blocks. In theory, they should all be the same size, but often a few will be longer or shorter than the others. In order for your quilt to end up flat with squared edges, you'll want to work on mitigating these differences. First, find the average size between the largest and the smallest block. This is the size you'll cut your 6 middle pieces of sashing. If you have blocks that are more than 1/8 of an inch off from this average size, you might have to redo them or choose a different setting that's more random. If a block is larger than the average size, you can trim some of the excess if it's a rectangular shape. But be aware that trimming can lead to problems. If there are points on the edges, you can't trim, as this will cause you to lose the point later when sewing to the sashing. If a block is smaller than the average size by 1/8 of an inch or less, you can try to ease it in. You can also use easing when dealing with larger blocks. Put right sides together, place the longer piece on the bottom, pin on each end, find the middle, and pin. Your feed dogs will help to evenly distribute this extra fabric if you place the longer piece against them. Sew an accurate 1/4 inch seam. It's like magic. This edge and this edge match up. After sewing, you'll want to press to the sashing, as that's the way the seams naturally fall. Some of the blocks won't need easing, just sew sashing to the side. A word of caution: make sure you know which blocks get sashing on both sides. It's a good idea to take a photo that you can refer back to before you start sewing. One of the nice things about adding sashing to your blocks is you get to avoid having to match these intersections, as opposed to no sashing where you will have to match that. However, you still have to be careful about not cutting off these triangle points. To ensure that I don't cut off this triangle tip, I want to sew not right through the intersection, but one thread over. You can see as I was sewing, I moved about a thread over in this direction so as not to come right in the middle of that intersection. And there's that point. Here are some other areas that you'll want to focus on. This block might not look like it has tips that need to be saved, but notice that these areas are triangles and there's tips on both ends. First, check and make sure that the diagonal line intersects this corner. Use a leader to make sure that you sew a 1/4 inch seam as soon as you come onto your fabric. Use a follower when ending the seam. This tip should be 1/4 of an inch from the edge. When adding this piece, I need to remind myself to check where those points are. And here's where those 2 points meet. If you'd like some more information about sewing triangle points, check out our last video. You'll find a link below. When each row has been completed, it's time to add these horizontal strips between them. Use the width of the middle row as a guide for cutting your sashing. If one row is larger or smaller than the rest, you'll use easing to get everything in line. This will help keep your quilt squared up. Before pinning these two rows, find the midpoint and make a mark. Fold in half again. I like to crease it just a little and then make a mark. Match those marks and pin. Make sure to match the ends and pin. When you sew, put the longest side up against your feed dogs. I'll need to change these pins to the other side to make it easier to sew. I've sewn the sashing on the bottom of these two rows. Now I'm ready to sew these two sections together, but first I need some registration marks in order to keep the blocks lined up vertically. Follow this vertical sashing line and make a mark. These marks should match the edge of the sashing. When I put right sides together, I want these marks matching up with the seam lines, not to be confused with these other marks for easing in. Press after sewing. This last row is shorter than the sashing. Before easing, mark the vertical sashings. You might have to move this row in order to do those markings. Pin and sew. Match these markings and pin. Pin the ends and then pin the center of your block. You want to try to distribute that extra fabric evenly between the other pins. I'll place this longer side down against my pressure foot and sew. Next, you'll want to add the two side sashings. Measure through the middle, make a mark, and cut. Put right sides together and ease if necessary. After pressing, add the last two strips. Measure through the center and then cut. And here's my completed top. Hope you find these tips useful. By the way, if you would like to make any of these blocks, you'll find links to free step-by-step videos and patterns below. You'll learn different beginner skills with each block. No time to search for fabric? Visit our shop where you'll find kits that include the fabric for these. So glad you visited learnhowtoquilt.com. Please share our videos with your friends. Don't forget to sign up for updates and free patterns at our website. Thanks.